So we talked last time about geometric and organic shapes, and we started drawing our shapes on our watercolor paper. We also talked about the difference between watercolor paper and regular paper. And so today we're going to talk about coloring our color schemes, and I'm going to teach you specifically about watercolor pencils. So first let's talk about coloring our squares. So we each have 4 squares, and your 4 different squares are going to be 4 different color schemes. So this one here, I am doing warm color scheme. So I have some warm color pencils, red, orange, yellow, and I have pink in here too. And when I color my spaces, I don't want any of the same color to touch another space that's the same color. Okay, so for example, I can't color this space red because I already have red here. I don't want the same space to touch. And every time I cross over a line, I change the color. So the best way to do this really is sort of plan it out before you color it, but also it works to start with the bigger space first and then kind of follow that space along the paper. So I sort of did it not in the right order when I filled this space in, but that's not a big deal. So if I'm looking at my colors that I have and I need to color this big space in, it's already touching red, so I can't use red. It's touching orange, so I can't use orange. It's touching yellow, so I can't use yellow. But it's not touching pink. They're only kitty corner. So I'm going to make this space pink, and I'll color it in a minute. I'm going to do the same thing over here because this space is also touching all these same spaces. So I can kind of lightly plan it out, and then I can go in and figure out what color I'm going to make all of these other little pieces. I'm going to have a little bit more leeway on what colors I make them because they're not touching as many spaces. So maybe this one's going to be red. Maybe this one will be yellow. I'll make this one orange. I'll make this one orange. I'll make this one red. I can kind of plan it out, and then I can color them in afterwards. That way, you don't end up coloring yourself into a corner. If I hop and skip around and say, I want this one red, and this one red, and this one red, and this one red, by the time you get all the spaces colored, you're probably going to end up with a space that you can't color any color because it already touches the other color. So you want to be sure to start from one spot and work your way around from there. And usually it's good to start with the biggest spot as your starting point. Okay, so I've marked those off. Now, watercolor pencils. They look very much like colored pencils. They come in the same colors. The only real difference that you will see is that our watercolor pencils have little paintbrushes on the sides. Watercolor pencils are different because the wax in them is water soluble. That means that when we add water to it, it sort of dissolves and it will look like paint. And so there's a couple different techniques that you can use with watercolor pencils. But when we start out, when you color with them, you're going to color just the same as you would with a regular color pencil. It's going to look exactly the same until we add water to it. So when I'm coloring, I'm still going to be careful when I color. I'm going to think about my direction. Am I coloring nice and even? I don't want lots of color lines from scratching really hard or anything like that. I'm just going to do a nice even color. It is a lot of space. Okay. And then I can kind of go back if I want it to be a little bit darker on some of those other spaces. Now, The other thing with watercolor pencils, the same thing that we kind of ran into when we were doing tertiary colors on our color notes, is if I want yellow-orange, I don't have yellow-orange, so I need to make yellow-orange. So for these orange spaces, I'm going to make them yellow-orange. So I can color them yellow, and then to make it yellow-orange, I'm going to cross-hatch my yellow over top of the orange. All right, I'm going to color in this red space. Okay, so let me show you what it does. So now that I've got some spaces colored, and in fact you will color all of it. I would suggest coloring all of it first. I'm going to get a paintbrush and water. I wipe the water off a little bit on the edge because I don't want it to have a ton of water in it. And then I'm just going to paint the water right over top of the space that I've colored. And you'll notice that it kind of blends all those colors, all those lines together and to look like paint. Oop, I have a lot of water. I didn't wipe it off this time. I want to be really careful on my edges. And I'm still thinking about keeping sort of an even coloring job so that my paint doesn't have lots of lines in it. Okay, so that is the basics of watercolors. Now I'm still going to wash my paintbrush out in between, but here's the next trick. When you color your spaces, when you add water to your spaces, you don't want two wet spots to be next to each other because what will happen is the paint will bleed together. So I could go over here and paint this space. But when I go to paint this space, it'll pull the color in. You see how the red went into the orange? It bled together, and even the red's gone over the edge over here a little bit too. It bled together, and we don't want to do that. So that's why you sort of want to let it dry in between doing different spaces. But let's say that happens. Oh no, what do? I accidentally bled my paper. So all you need to do is get a wet paper towel, and you can dab it off, and then you can just do it over again. If you needed to. So like this little red bit here isn't as dark anymore, so I can color over that. And do it again. Okay, another thing with color pencils, watercolor pencils, is there's a couple different ways that you can actually do this. So what I've done so far is I've just colored it just like we would with regular color pencils, and then gone over it with the water. Now, if I decided that my colors weren't dark enough, or I didn't like how these two colors blended together, maybe I wanted it to be more yellow, I can wait for it to dry, and then I can go over it again, and then add water over it again, and sort of alter that color. You can still sort of play with the colors that way. Another thing that I can do is you can actually work with watercolors when the paper is wet. So if you were a student that shows a lot of lines when you color, like these are just sort of my template for what color goes where, but if when I color I show a lot of color lines, something you could try would be to make it wet first, and then add your color on top, because it will blend as you're coloring it. And see how that's nice and solid and it doesn't have any directional lines in it. So you can do that as well. You have to be a little careful just because you'll go through more color pencil that way if you start with it wet. But that is one other way that you can use watercolor pencils. And I do have some scratch watercolor paper if you want to sort of test out some different ways that watercolor pencils work before you use it on your project. You are welcome to do that. That would be fantastic.